was feeling so suicidal, and just I think that my feelings of being suicidal were coming from a place of, it's just not going to get better. I didn't have any hope. Like, the way that it felt like my mind was so far gone from reality, and I just didn't know how to get back to a place where my feet were on the ground.
Hey, Rachel.
Hi, Beaulah.
How are you?
I'm doing good. How are you doing?
I'm doing wonderful. Thank you. Well, welcome to Navigating Life podcast.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
Absolutely. Would you tell us a little bit about yourself?
Yes. So my name is Rachel, as you said, and I live in Austin. I work as a filmmaker. So I primarily work as an art director, so basically doing interior design for movies. That's how I describe it to people.
Okay.
But I am also working in the documentary filmmaking world, so just dabbling in all types of things in filmmaking.
Okay, good. Good. Interesting.
Yes.
Interesting.
Yeah.
So, Rachel, I know you've been living with OCD. And so would you take us on this journey of, this phase? When did it start? A little bit about that self, please.
Yeah, so I have lived with OCD since I was around 12, 13 years old. That's when my symptoms first started. And a lot of people think that OCD a lot of it has to do with like contamination and germs, and that definitely is a type of OCD that people live with. But my OCD looks different. There's a lot of different subtypes of OCD. So two of the main things that I dealt with were a type of OCD called scrupulosity, which is religious OCD. And then another type, which I think a lot of people can relate to, is perfectionism. That was a very difficult type of OCD that I dealt with. And so I started having symptoms when I was around 13 years old. And I didn't really know that it was OCD for a very long time. For about 10 years, I lived with these two types of OCD. And it was only when I turned 24 that I got the official diagnosis. And that was when I started going to therapy, and when my therapist diagnosed me with having OCD.
Wow, that was a long time to have struggled and not know that it was OCD. Did you know that it was OCD this whole time?
No, it was very strange because in high school, a lot of my compulsions were, to kind of explain how my OCD used to work. I would have, if I had, with my religious OCD, it was, if I had a bad thought about God, or if I did something that I thought was sinful, I would have to kind of replace it with like a good thought or a positive thought, or I would like tap things a certain amount of times. That was one of my compulsions, that I would have to like tap things like 3 times or 10 times in order to kind of like take the thought away. OCD is a little bit difficult to wrap your mind around when it gets into the types of OCD, like religious OCD or perfectionism. But that was in high school. That was one of my compulsions, that I just spent a lot of time like tapping things and trying to like think good thoughts. And it wasn't very obvious to me, because the way that OCD is portrayed in the media is usually like hand washing or turning a light switch on and off. And so it was a lot more mental obsessions and compulsions that were going on internally. So I didn't know that it was OCD, and I had no idea. I just thought that, I don't know what I thought.
That's, that's the reason, I'm passionate about, like, this is the point of this podcast and this channel is, bring awareness, right? Especially cultural aspect of it as well, because I grew up in India, so like the awareness, the mental health awareness isn't there that much. And like for you, like from 13 to 24, that's like over a decade of you struggling. Had you had help or had the awareness or knew about it, probably your life would have been better, different and better, right? Because I remember from your story, at 24, you were at that dark place, right? And I think that's the reason you went to the treatment. So could you take us to that place, please?
Yeah, so when I got my diagnosis at 24, that was when I started to go to therapy more consistently. And it was good for, about 4 years. I was going in and out of therapy, and just, sometimes my OCD symptoms would get better and sometimes it was worse. So when I turned 28, that's kind of when things snowballed, I would say. And oftentimes when people have, one type of mental illness, sometimes there's different types that will kind of start to show up. And so for me, I've dealt with OCD, but also anxiety since a young age, and then also panic attacks. I had no idea that they were panic attacks that I was having, in high school and college. But I also started to have depression. Depression isn't something that I deal with on a day-to-day basis, but it was during this season in my life that it really started to present itself more, I would say. And so at age 28, my therapist actually, she had suggested that I start taking medication. For years, she had actually been asking, do I want to take medication? And my thought was, no, I don't want to, I'll do everything more naturally, exercise and eat well and go to therapy and meditate and all of these things, which are very important in order to learn how to cope with your mental illness that you're dealing with. But I think for me personally, in my life and in my struggles, medicine was actually very important, because when you're dealing with a mental illness, it might be factors, things that are happening in your life, different life situations, but oftentimes for a lot of people it's like a chemical imbalance that's happening in your brain. With OCD, it is genetic, or research has pointed to it being genetic. And so I think that is something that is often overlooked, and a lot of people, especially in our culture, a lot of people in the Indian culture, don't really want to look towards medication. And I understand that there can be a lot of different side effects, and for some people, medication doesn't work. But for me, I think that the imbalance was just so great, and it was just getting worse and worse and worse. And so, but I kept on resisting taking medication. And so it eventually just got to the point where the depression was very heavy, the anxiety, I was starting to dissociate, the OCD was getting worse, and eventually I was hospitalized. There was a day that we were actually together. We were taking a family trip. Beaulah and I are related through marriage. So we were all taking a family trip together, and in Galveston, and there was one night when I was very, very suicidal, and it was very difficult. I did not voluntarily go to the hospital. It was kind of a decision that my parents were there, and Vijay, your husband, helped them, take me to the hospital and everything, and it was very difficult. I was in the hospital for about 10 days, and after that, I did an inpatient treatment program for my OCD specifically, and that's when things started to really get better, and I started taking medication, started balancing more, and so it was a very difficult 3 months, I would say, 3 months solidly of just continuously working at therapy, taking medication, community support, prayer, everything, all of these things. And I feel very blessed, and I feel very lucky to have a lot of resources in life, because I realize that a lot of people don't have those luxuries that I was able to have. For example, I took 3 months off of work. A lot of people are not able to do that. They don't have the flexibility, or they might not have the financial flexibility to do that. And so I was in a very, very blessed and lucky position to be able to do that, to really take those 3 months to focus on my mental health, because it was symptoms were so severe that I really needed that time to be able to address what was really going on. So it was definitely difficult, but I was able to, learn how to cope with my OCD and my anxiety and my depression.
So would you say that this is a result of the way you grew up, or the barriers, the mindset, barriers, the mental barriers that, hey, the stigma of mental health, that, like, medication or the treatment, or what would people think, like, do you feel like all those kind of um, added to that resistance that you didn't want it to?
I definitely think so. I think growing up, both of us growing up, there wasn't the internet, there wasn't social media, there wasn't a lot of examples of different mental health illnesses. I don't even know if I knew what OCD was until, my 20s. And so I think that there was definitely less information about it. There wasn't podcasts like this, to spread awareness about different struggles that people are going through. And so I think that was a factor, just the lack of information, of when we were growing up. And then I think as far as like the stigma, I remember when I started going to therapy in my early 20s, I told my sister that I was going to therapy, but I didn't tell my parents. Because I think especially in the Indian culture, family is so important and community is so important. And I kind of thought that my parents would think, oh, why didn't you talk to us about, or why don't you talk to us about it? Why don't you tell us what the problems or the issues are? But, and so I didn't want to tell my parents that I was going to therapy, because I think it comes off as a very westernized thing to go to therapy. I think nowadays it's becoming a lot more normalized, but even, my parents' generation, I don't know how many people in our parents' generation are going to therapy. It's still kind of like, I think in their generation it's still more, it seems unnecessary, but I'm of the mindset that everybody, if they have the means, everybody should be able to go to therapy. Everybody should be given that opportunity.
Absolutely. I think our parents' generation definitely views, that therapy or this as a sign of weakness, right? That stigma of mental health, right? And also what would people think? I think it really hinders a lot of, people, that perfectionism, the Asian culture of this being high achiever, you're perfect, your life is perfect, your kids are perfect, like everything, like you strive, you don't want to take a break, you keep going, go, right? I think that definitely leads to burnout, but also like, it could be prevented, right? That awareness, I feel like if they knew, obviously no internet, so they didn't have that information, right? But even for us, like, we have the information, but I feel like that generational conditioning, right? Like that kind of flows into us, and we're like, we feel, right? We've come a long way, right? Like going to therapy. I believe in therapy, right? Like go. Medication, if you need it, take it, right? But absolutely, it's a good thing, right? Internet is a good thing, social media is a good thing. How you use it, these are just tools, how we use them, right? So would you take us to that place when you were like really in the hospital, and you had mentioned about something about psychosis? Would you take us there for a bit?
Yeah, I think for me what was really difficult was I felt very, it was a lot of disassociation. And I think it was, and I definitely experienced psychosis when I was in the hospital. And I think that it was, I just didn't understand what was going on. And I think that it was really difficult because it seemed like for me, I think my one of the things, the images that like sticks in my mind is I remember when I was experiencing the psychosis and the dissociation, I was just thinking about, there's so many people who are homeless, or people who are who are veterans, and who don't necessarily have like the family support or the resources, and just sometimes you see people on the street and they're talking to themselves, or there seems like there's something off, and it's just I just remember feeling like the way that my brain was, and the way that I was like feeling everything, just felt like this is how so many people experience life when they don't have the resources and the support, and the things like family, community, all of those things. And it's so tough because I don't know what we can do. Like how do we help people not reach that state, but I think that with the medication and with all of the resources that I had, I was able to stabilize, and I was able to come out of a place of, I was feeling so suicidal, and just I think that my feelings of being suicidal were coming from a place of, it's just not going to get better. I didn't have any hope. Like the way that it felt like my mind was so far gone from reality, and I just didn't know how to get back to a place where my feet were on the ground. And I didn't think that it was possible. Like I was so far gone that I wasn't even thinking like, how would this hurt my loved ones if I did this? How would, like, is this the best option? You're not being rational in that mindset. You're not being logical. You're not thinking through these things because you're just not stable.
Yeah.
And so I think, with suicide, it's very difficult because I think there is a lot of judgment on that topic, especially if, somebody has seeming stability in their life, they have family support, all of these things, and if somebody does take their life, I feel like there's a lot of judgment from the community of like, oh, they had these things, like why did they decide to do that? But it's just so difficult. So I think that a lot of people feel, when they're feeling hopeless or when they're feeling suicidal, it's a feeling of lacking hope. It's a feeling of just not understanding that your situation can change. It kind of feels permanent in a way. And I think it's that specific mindset of, can things get better? And you kind of think that they can't. And I think that one thing that is important to remember is that everything comes and goes. Everything is changing all of the time. But it's so difficult to remember that when you're feeling suicidal, because it just feels like nothing can change. I would hope that if, somebody doesn't necessarily know what that feels like to be suicidal, that they would, when they do hear stories of people who are suicidal, that they would take time to understand what that might be like, and to kind of reserve their judgment, because it's just so difficult. And there's also, when you are suicidal, I think there's a lot of different ways that you can be suicidal. Like there is more of like a passive suicidality, where you might be having passive thoughts. It might not be something that you want to act on, but maybe every day you're having those thoughts. Versus, somebody can be actively suicidal when they're thinking of, all of the steps that they want to take, or they're getting their affairs in order. And so there's often, when somebody says that they're suicidal, it can mean a lot of different things. And so I think that's also important to understand when it comes to talking about feeling suicidal, which is something that, we should definitely be more open in speaking about. But I think that one of my main messages to, anybody who might be feeling like this is just that remembering that everything is changing, and that nothing is permanent or consistent. The only thing that is certain is uncertainty and taxes.
Absolutely. I'm glad you were brave enough to share that topic, and also talk about that, because that hopelessness, that is what we're trying to do through this podcast, is give hope. Everyone is fighting a battle. You're living with OCD. It's not gone, right? You live with it. You've learned some coping mechanisms. You have tools, and you know how to live with it. And so through sharing these stories, we want to give hope to people. Like, you did it. We did it, and we can do it. You can do it. Let's just fight, like, today. Let's just focus on today and fight the battle and give hope. Like you said, like, it's not permanent. It feels like in our mind when we are in that situation, it's permanent. And that's why you come to that place of, oh, it's better for me not to be on this earth anymore. But there is hope. There is always hope. And that's the message through our podcast, definitely. And thank you for sharing that, Rachel. I appreciate that. What is next for you?
So when I was in treatment, I have to give credit to one of the patients that was in the treatment program with me, because I remember he said, oh man, OCD is it's such an interesting topic, because the type of treatment for OCD, it's called exposure response prevention. And what that entails, it's a specific type of therapy where instead of avoiding your fears, you're actually facing your fears head on. And so it looks very interesting. Like, exposure response therapy is just one of the most difficult types of treatment that somebody has to do, I think. And so he said to me, I remember in treatment, he said, oh, it'd be so interesting if somebody made a documentary about this. And so after that, I was just thinking, yeah, like, I work in the film industry. Maybe I should make a documentary about this. And so I really wanted to make a documentary about OCD to spread awareness about the more taboo types of OCD. And so in our documentary, we cover 3 main types of OCD. We cover harm OCD, pedophilia OCD, and postpartum OCD. And most of you probably haven't heard of those types of OCD, and because they're so taboo, nobody really wants to talk about what they're experiencing. And so that is something that I am very passionate about spreading awareness about. And so we have been working on this documentary for 4 years now. It's been a very long time. My sister is one of the producers, and Kovid Gupta, who is also on your podcast, he is the other producer for the documentary, and he also struggles with OCD. And so it's a very personal story for all 3 of us, my sister living vicariously through me. But we have been working on it for 4 years. It's a feature-length documentary. We're about to be done with the editing stage, and then we're moving on to sound design, music composition, and all of that. And we've started to apply to film festivals, and our goal is to show this to as many people as we can. We want to show it at film festivals, but we also want to show it at mental health conferences. We are looking to travel to different cities of, a high concentrate of minority population, and, show it to people who might need to hear this story.
Yes, and you did a great job. I mean, I saw the raw version of the thing. You did a great job, and I personally did not know of all the taboo kind of OCDs. Most of us are familiar with, the germophobia and, the other kind of things. And, and this, you want to normalize this, right? Like, through your documentary. And we want to normalize these conversations, bring awareness, give hope through our podcast. What is a trait that you're proud of?
I think a trait that I'm proud of, like, with myself, okay, is my authenticity and my willingness to be open with other people about what I struggle with. I think that's really important, because how else do we grow as humans, just hearing other people's struggles and what they go through. It really helps you realize that you're not alone. I think that's what I struggled with for 10 years when I was undiagnosed, just thinking like, what's wrong with me? What's wrong with me? What's wrong with me? And then realizing that I am not alone. And I think that's really important for us all to share with each other what we're experiencing.
Yes, absolutely. Being vulnerable, right?
Yes.
And, sharing your story, because it empowers not only you, but also the people that will, watch or listen to your story. So thank you for being vulnerable, and thank you for coming on the podcast. I really appreciate it. What is a trait that you like or respect in other people?
I think that a trait that I really respect in other people that I feel like I don't necessarily have myself is self-discipline and perseverance. It really takes a lot for me to like motivate myself with this documentary. It's like 4 years, gotta get through this, and sometimes it's really difficult for me to get that motivation. And so, just seeing the perseverance and self-discipline that other people have to really go after their goals and their dreams. And even you, Beaulah, with this the podcast and everything, you're so determined, and I think that it's very respectable and very admirable to know, what you're passionate about. You can be passionate about something, but to see it through is an entirely different thing. And so, yeah, self-discipline and perseverance.
Thank you. I appreciate that. What I've learned in the past 2 years is don't waste your pain.
What does that mean?
Like, we've been through. You've used your pain to create a documentary. I've used my pain to start this podcast, to be there, to share, bring awareness, whatever like your goal is through that documentary, right? Bring awareness. Definitely bring awareness, give hope. By showcasing all of these, guests and their stories to show people, hey, like everybody's going through stuff. Be it OCD, be it, any other kind of challenge, medical challenge, or, struggle, losing a spouse, whatever it is. How do we navigate? Like, how did we overcome, right? How do we not give up? How did we persevere? So I feel like for me, definitely it inspires me when I hear stories of people that have overcome. And so hopefully through your story that people will, hey, she did it. She overcame. She's here and talking about her journey, difficult journey, right? It wasn't easy. I mean, we've seen it. So I know, I can only imagine going through that, and those 10 years of not even knowing what was, like you were saying, what was wrong with me. I feel like a lot of people go through that, like, not knowing, and then that, feeling that judgment, right? Like, placing upon themselves and suffering and alone. And then when we bring things to light, other people on the other side can see, hey, I'm not alone.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? So, so I'm glad you did that. I know you have a life motto.
Yes.
Would you like to share?
Yes. So one thing that was very important for me in treatment is to let go. And that's I have it tattooed on my wrist here. I don't know.
Yeah.
Y'all can see it. Yeah. But letting go is very important. It's important for everybody, but I think with people who struggle with OCD specifically, because OCD is really a disorder that has to do with control. It has to do with being able to control what's happening in life, and it's impossible, right? Like you can only try so much. And so I think for me, one of my biggest things that I learned through treatment was to let go and to really embrace uncertainty. We can try as hard as we can to make things go the way that we want them to go. But I think in the end of the day, learning to let go is one of my biggest lessons in life, because I think so much of my anxiety stems from a desire to make sure that things go a certain way. But when you let go, it's almost like just a sense of relief and joy, and also excitement about like the mysteries of life. Like you never know what's going to happen, and so it can be very exhilarating to just let go and see what happens.
Yeah, we want control, right? And letting go is so hard, especially if you want control, and that perfectionism, like that, the control is kind of that part of that perfectionism, right?
Right.
And so letting go is hard. It's like one day at a time.
Yeah.
One day at a time, and we can do this. And would you share? I know you have a couple of resources that helped you on your journey. Would you share those resources with us, please?
Yeah, so one of the biggest things that was helpful for me in treatment was this app called Headspace. And I think a lot of people are familiar with it. I think now you can pick different voices, but originally it was like this British man that had a very, very soothing voice. And but Headspace is great. There's a paid version, but there's also a free version. And I used to do it before going to bed, and throughout the day I would take time to meditate. I would just put it on my headphones and listen to it for like an hour. And I think meditation, any resources that you can find for meditating is very helpful. There is a website called NoCD. It's an organization that was actually founded by somebody who lived with severe OCD himself. And so NoCD has different resources for people in terms of therapists. They do teletherapy, and they cover a lot of different insurance companies. And so if you're looking for a therapist, like telehealth, you can definitely, and you have OCD, you can definitely look at that website and find different resources. And the therapist practice exposure response prevention, which is very important for people who struggle with OCD. And so that is a really good resource. And then there's also the International OCD Foundation. It has, on their website, they have a lot of different links to books and websites, and even like how to find a therapist in your area, depending on what state you live in. And they actually have a conference, an annual conference every summer. And so the International OCD Foundation is also a great resource.
Yeah, thank you. That's really helpful. People, if they're, like initial stages, or they, like, hey, where do I go? What do I do? So free resources.
Yes,
absolutely helpful. Thank you for sharing that. Rachel, would you share with our audience some tips or advice or some coping mechanisms that helped you on this, living with OCD journey?
Yeah, so I think if you are somebody who's struggling with OCD or really any type of mental illness, there's a couple of pieces of advice that have helped me. The first thing is self-awareness and awareness in general. I think really knowing what you yourself are dealing with and taking time to do self-reflection. It is very difficult to do that, but it is very worth it to realize what is really going on internally, whether that's if you've dealt with trauma in your past, or there's some relationships that you're struggling with. Really just taking the time to be aware. And that can be you can find that out in many different ways. You can journal, you can talk to a therapist, you can talk to a friend, but really being aware of what is going on internally is very important. My second piece of advice is talking to people. It doesn't necessarily have to be a public platform like this where you're sharing your story publicly, but just making sure that you have at least one person, whether it's a friend, a family member, a stranger, a therapist, whoever that is, just at least one other person who you're able to speak to about what you're going through, somebody that you're able to be honest and open with. I think that relationships are very important to help us get through a lot of struggles in life. My last piece of advice is to take baby steps. I think that sometimes it can be a little bit overwhelming in our day and age where there are a lot of resources, there's a lot of options that you can do to get, self-help. But I think just remembering baby steps and knowing that it will take time, to not expect results overnight. It takes time, it takes perseverance and self-discipline. And those baby steps, eventually you'll see progress and change, but it will be gradual, because good things are worth waiting for, and good things take time. And so baby steps, don't give up on the hope for change, because it can happen. It just sometimes takes a little bit longer than we might hope.
Yes. Thank you, Rachel. Thank you for being on the podcast, and thank you for your sharing your story. I'm definitely inspired, and I've seen such huge, change in you, and I'm so proud of you.
Thank you.
And wishing you all the best for Mind Games. Is it?
Yes.
Is it finalized, the name, or are you still
Still a TBD?
Okay. Hey, if you have any suggestions for her documentary, please comment. Absolutely. Just let's help her out.
Yes.
And thank you for watching us, and thank you for listening to the podcast. I really appreciate this community that we have on YouTube, and we'll see you next time.
Bye. Thank you.